focus on how do you increase your skill set to add value to whatever it is that you're doing. Be willing to sacrifice, to do what it takes to learn what you need to learn to be successful, however you define success.
Welcome to the 2% Factor podcast, where we explore small things that make a massive difference in someone's journey and story. Welcome today, Tom Huber. Tom has led multiple companies over his career and is a very good friend of mine. Please welcome Tom to the podcast as we explore his secrets to success and the things he's going to share today about his journey and his story and his 2% Factor moments. Welcome, Tom.
It's great to be here, Dan. I'm really looking forward to this.
Awesome. Well, let's start with this. How many companies have you led over the years?
So, about 4 different companies over the years in terms of being the CEO or president of those companies. Everything from divisions of Fortune 500 firms to private equity, venture capital based companies. So it's been a broad mixture.
Well, and you and I worked together during one of those stints where you were the CEO of the company that I worked for and my direct boss for many years, which I had the pleasure of working for you. And we've had a lot of conversations about different dynamics, workplace dynamics, career navigation, wealth building. I mean, you and I have basically talked about it all. So I'm really looking forward to breaking a variety of different subjects down with you and things that you've learned, over your time.
I do feel like I have these scars of experience of many, many years.
Well, hopefully I didn't cause too many of those scars for you.
None from you, I'll say that much.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how did you navigate your career in order to ultimately lead around 4 companies at that C level. How did that happen for you? How would you break that down?
So I think that some people sit back and say, hey, when I was young, I started out with a plan to do this and a plan to do that and a plan to do this and a plan to do that. I didn't really have that kind of a plan. As we've talked about in the past, I grew up on a farm. And growing up on a dairy farm, is a different kind of lifestyle. And I figured out pretty quickly that I was flunking farming. So I needed to do something else. But I didn't know exactly what that was. And I felt like I needed to find my way off the farm. So it wasn't like I was going for something, I was running from something else.
Which I think that's the case for a lot of people, right? You maybe grew up a certain way, or you had a life of the lifestyle of a certain one, and you said, I don't want that. I want something different. I want something better. How do I go make it happen?
And growing up on a farm, there were expectations that I was the oldest son and I would take over the farm. So there were certain expectations. But I remember being like 14 years old. It's a cold, rainy, snow, sleety kind of day, and I'm working the corn picker on Thanksgiving Day, and the corn picker broke down. So I'm now underneath the corn picker trying to figure out how to fix it. And there's mud draining down on me, water draining down on me. And I remember thinking to myself, there just has to be a better way to make a living. And so I kind of targeted after that. I was like, I'm going to do something different because I just can't do this. I'm not that good at it. And as I said, I flunked farming, so I had to do something else.
So what steps did you take at that point?
Well, my thoughts at that time were that I needed to get an education. So I thought, I need to go to college. I need to do something to get a job. And on the college front, at first I thought, oh, this is really cool. I would love to study philosophy. Then I thought, not so sure that's going to give me a job at the end of it. And then I said, okay, what about political science? Well, maybe then I need to go to law school. And then in the end, I decided to major in accounting. And it was as simple as I thought, I'll be able to get a job after that. And nothing overly scientific other than to say, I think that will get me employed. So that was my goal.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. That's a perfect example of a micro step, right? A lot of times they meet somebody who's had the success and achievements that you've had, and they think there was some super highway to it. And in fact, as we both know, it's a 100 or 200 or 300 micro steps and decisions you make along the way that navigate to that path.
Yeah, it's a journey from the perspective that it's not clear what the end result is or the end path, and it's how do you zig and how do you zag and how do you work your way through it, hopefully with some good mentors or someone else to help you out. But coming from the family that I came from, even doing something like college was almost unheard of in the area that I grew up. So that was a big step unto itself, is to say, hey, what do you mean you're going to college? Why don't you get a job at the John Deere plant that pays, $10 an hour at the time, or the packing house, slaughterhouse, where you can get $10 an hour? And I was like, I'm not going to go that path. And so you have to choose your own path in terms of how do you define success.
I think that is a really good point. We haven't really explored that too much. The fact that you just said it is about choosing the path, though, because I think when you choose it, there's a sense of empowerment there. And also, I think a sense of accountability that also plays a role in that path as you navigate to your success.
Yes, I think so too. I think it is a case of it does feel empowering to say, hey, I'm going to go down this path. I'm going to see what comes out of it. No guarantees of anything. And if it doesn't work out, be proactive to change direction and go down another path. And I didn't really have a lot of strong mentorship or anything that said, hey, go do this. Here's the formula. Here's how it works. It was more a case of meandering a bit to try to find the path that worked for me.
It's interesting. I've always known through our relationship that there's been a lot of common bonds, but the more you talk, it's really phenomenal the things that come out and how similar our journeys were in terms of even early on. Same for me, right? You had some great people around you and your parents who give you the advice that they give you, and then you've got to figure it out. And let's talk about this for a second. I don't view you as a high risk individual, but I do view you as a person who's willing to take a risk and a calculated risk when you take one. What's your perspective on risk taking?
So I would say risk taking is absolutely critical. And you're right. I mean, I tend to be on the conservative side from taking risks, but to me, it has to be a calculated risk. Let's face it, I mean, Las Vegas was built on 51% odds in terms of the house winning. So what I've always tried to do is to stack it a little bit in my favor in terms of the probabilities of a good outcome. But no guarantees in terms of it. But if I look back at, growing up and everything, I would have encouraged myself to take more risk, to step outside my comfort zone, to do the things that say, hey, you know what, this might not work out, but I'm going to gain incredible experience from it. And I would certainly say anyone that's listening to this, take more risk, step outside your comfort zone, be willing to say, you know what, this might fail, but if it does, I'll get back up on my feet and move forward. So I would encourage anyone to take more risk, and I wish that I would have earlier in my career.
When you look back, is there a time or an example that you can think of where you could have taken a bigger risk and where that comes to mind for you?
I would say definitely. I think that just by choosing to major in accounting, which, let's face it, I wasn't in love with accounting, you know, but I thought that was a safe route to go in terms of being employed. So even after college, I went to work for one of the big consulting firms and did well and everything else. But I stayed in accounting for 10 years before I moved out of it. And looking back on that now, I kind of wish that I would have switched to something earlier because I didn't really love it that much. I mean, I couldn't be passionate about it. And I remember early in my career, someone said to me, if you're a CPA or you're an accountant, basically it's like your job is after the battle is done, you go out and you count the bodies and you bayonet the wounded. And they said, at what point in time are you going to be leading the charge in the battle? And I think that was something too that I said to myself, yeah, maybe this whole accounting thing, count the bodies, bayonet the wounded. Nah, maybe how do I position myself to lead the charge and win the battle? And that took some significant change on my part to go a different mindset that says, hey, I'm gonna take more risk and I'm gonna tackle it, see what happens.
Makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. And that was a choice that you made. And what did you shift at that point? What happened there?
Well, I shifted jobs. So at one time I was, like everything else, I was involved in a acquisition, and I've had 7 acquisitions in my life where companies were acquiring the companies that I work for. And there's always dramatic change when that happens. And basically, the new team said to me, hey, the reality is we got plenty of accountants, so we don't need you. But we will give you a chance if you'd like to run customer service and sales to the customers. How do you feel about that? And I said, be unemployed or take a shot at this. I'll take a shot at this. And it took me out of the finance and accounting arena into a much more direct engagement with clients and selling to clients and everything that comes with that. And it was a dramatic change, but it was a good change. But I had to learn a lot. I was drinking from a fire hose, but it was a great experience.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and you and I talked about this for many years over my career and your career as well, that opportunity to broaden your experience. If you want to be a leader, there comes a point where you've been successful in one path, right? And you've earned your way into a leadership spot in that. And then there's that time where you have to broaden that. And that was that moment for you, where you had the accounting experience, and then next now you moved over to client success, customer success, account management, and sales.
And the key thing there was, I had reached the level where I was the CFO of a company, which is a good position, C slot, but it's a long way from CFO to CEO. And how do you close that gap? And that was a pivotal moment from the perspective that I said, okay, I have the finance behind me now. Let me get experience in other areas. Doing a sales type job was a very foreign experience. Managing a relationship with a client, very foreign kind of experience. So it was dramatic, but it was also fantastic from the perspective that it broadened my horizons in terms of positioning myself for success to become a CEO.
Well, it makes all the sense in the world. I mean, we know that most of the CEOs will either come out of a C-level finance position, a C-level sales leadership position, CRO, EVP. I think we're now seeing CEOs also coming up through client success. It can happen through professional services, but at the end of the day, when we're in those interviews and we've been there, you have to be able to be broad with your experience in order to convince those above, whether that's a board or another entity that is making that decision on who's going to be the CEO, that you have the ability to manage all functions.
That's right. So I think that experience level of having the finance as a background was terrific because accounting is the language of business. And it allows you to engage in a conversation with the VC, private equity type people, stockholders. But the whole front end side of it, in terms of dealing with relationships and developing relationships with clients, is missing just as a CFO. So I then said, okay, I'm going to tag every base. I'm going to be responsible for the client relationships. I'm going to become responsible for new sales. I'm going to become responsible for R&D. I'm going to do it domestically. I'm going to do it internationally. I'm going to tag all the bases. so that then I was positioned to become a CEO with having the credentials behind it of the experience of doing that. So you're just in a different position.
I love this conversation, particularly because you really don't get an opportunity to have this conversation typically until you're down your career path and you've found somebody who is willing to talk about this with you.
Right.
Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? I mean, there was that moment for me where with you, and along the way, previous to you with Sue Faltico, previous manager of mine, and ironically in the finance area, right? She was CFO. And when I think back to those times, someone who's willing to take the time and invest in you and say, look, you're great at this. You now need to be great at these other things, or at least good enough to be able to ask the right questions, understand when something's off, and dig in and solve problems in a broader level.
Well, and that's where it does come back to it's so important to be willing to step outside your comfort zone and say, hey, I'm going to take on something that I don't really fully understand, but I'm going to figure it out fast. And for example, in the sales and client relationship arena, I remember putting together proposals to clients, and I thought to myself, this is a fantastic proposal. It's completely logical. Everything makes perfect sense. It shows the return on investment. How can my prospect say no? But they did. And I was like, whoa, what is going on here? This makes perfect sense in terms of this business proposal. Press hard 3 copies. But they didn't. Then a gentleman who was superb in sales kind of pulled me off to the side and he said, Tom, you make great proposals to the clients, but you're missing something. I'm like, what's that? He said, remember, logic loads the gun, but emotion pulls the trigger. He said, you've got all the logic, you've got all the business case, but you have not developed a relationship with that client from an emotional perspective for them to trust you enough to commit to a multi-million dollar proposal. So unless you build that relationship and that trust factor, you will never get the deal. And that was the most insightful comment to me that allowed me to go, oh, really? Then I had to put that in practice. And the next thing I know, I'm exceeding my quotas. I'm, 120, 140% of my quotas. But I didn't really get that right at the beginning. I just thought, well, it's perfectly logical. I started 3 copies.
That makes so much sense in your finance brain, in your accounting education, saying there's a check in every box. Of course, the answer is yes. Without that that confidence from the customer that you're going to get it done, the emotional connection with the client that you're the best choice for them and they feel good about going with you, right? That you have the right team around you that's going to ultimately help them get to their goals. When things get hard, what's going to happen then? Those are all the things that aren't in that checklist.
Well, and I think the other thing that's so important in terms of that is that you have to have the mindset that says, what is the win for the prospect out of this business case? And oftentimes it's not just purely the return on investment. There are other emotional triggers that are so critical that you have to at least address in terms of what does this mean in terms of security for the person? What does this mean in terms of their advancement? When I was doing very large transactions, I could never get a deal done unless I sat across the table from the president of that bank or the president of that college or university or the city manager who said, if this project doesn't go well, I will be fired. And I want your assurances that this is going to happen. You can make it happen. And you have to know and understand where is the prospect coming from? What's their win out of it beyond the return on investment? What level of risk are they taking and how do you mitigate that risk and how do you assure them that what you're doing is good for you and good for them and it's a win-win situation?
Boy, that's terrific advice. Terrific advice. And in the industry that we worked in, which was public safety software, and in the government sector, it really was life and death, and it really was job promotion or potential termination. That's a great, when I look back, that's a great grooming ground in terms of as your career goes on to work in an industry where the decision of who they select as a partner, as a vendor, is that important. Because now, forever in my life, every client I talk to, I think of it that way. I think of it as this decision is so important. They could lose their job, not be able to provide for their family, all the things that they need if they make the wrong choice. So it's an interesting mindset shift that comes along with you your whole career.
Well, and I think the other thing is, and I think this is important to understand, where can you be most successful? So, for example, I figured out a long time ago, I'm not really good in terms of what I would call transactional sales. You're going in to buy a pair of shoes, you're going to buy a pair of shoes, and then you're going out the door. For me, had a much better chance of success in a complex relationship sale where it's a long-term kind of relationship, and you're going to not only do the initial implementation in terms of a large project and it's going to be successful, but you're positioned for the long term with that client to be successful and build a long-term relationship. It's a much more complex relationship sale, but you have to figure out what your skills are and what fits best for you too.
That I think is tremendous advice because when I look back, I had a similar kind of understanding of myself, and I refer to it as commodity sales. And back then in my 20s, I knew that I wanted to be in more of a complex sale and made choices around my career where I was applying for jobs. That's really, really interesting that you pinpoint that. And great advice for people as they're looking at navigating their career. When you look back, what is some career advice you give to somebody as they're trying to figure out in their 20s, perhaps, in their early days? What is some career advice you would encourage them to think about as they're deciding how to tackle this subject?
Yeah. So I think the most important advice is not necessarily in this arena that I would say to any 22-year-old as you're starting out. You have to figure out what your goals are. How do you define success? But like in my case, I figured out that the most important goal for me was to figure out how to build equity somehow, some way. And I think that's really, really critical if that's important to you. I mean, everyone defines success differently. I mean, some people might define success as, hey, I'm helping the homeless or I'm solving world hunger. I think you have to define what success is and then figure out how do you gain the best skill set to acquire equity, however you define equity in that arena. So to me, it comes back to growth. How do you position yourself for growth, continuous learning to become really, really good at something to the point that there's a strong demand for what it is that you're doing. And then, the old saying of, hey, anyone can take away your car, they can take away your house, but they can't take away the investment between your ears. So your brain is so critical in terms of how much you invest in it. So to me, it's all about continuous learning. It's all about how do you position yourself for equity? How do you position yourself for growth? And be willing to take the risk that comes with that. Some of those choices that you're going to have to make along the way.
Terrific advice, by the way, terrific advice. I hope people follow it because that has impacted my life significantly. How do you define success?
So that's kind of interesting. I mean, I think the definition of success for me when I was 22 years old is very different than my definition of success now at the stage of life that I'm in.
Yeah, how has it changed?
When I was 22 years old, my definition of success was classically, the material things from the perspective of, as I said before, I grew up on a farm. where you had next to nothing all the time. I mean, I wore hand-me-down clothes from my sisters. And I really loved playing basketball in grade school. And when my basketball shoes were worn out, I said, "Hey, I need new shoes for the fall." And my father looked at me and he said, "Well, if the pig prices are good, you get a pair. Otherwise, you wear the same ones you're wearing." And so I felt like growing up, well, I had a great family and there was lots of love. We couldn't rub two nickels together. So I think when I was 22 years old and now having an education and CPA and those kind of things behind me, I was like, I want things. I want a house. I want, a nice car. I want all these things. And I really said I'm going to pursue them for whatever it takes to get them. And I was successful at that. But as my career went along, I think that I also realized that, hey, now you're 35 years old, you have acquired all these material things, but there's so much more out there. And what's really important is your relationships. And you have to have this balance between pursuing things as a provider for your family or whatever, and the importance of relationships and how do you develop those relationships. Because now at the stage and age that I'm at now, relationships are the most important thing. I mean, how do you deal with the people that you love in your inner circle? And I think that my definition of success has kind of migrated over time.
I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think it rings true for a lot of people, right? Depending on how they grew up, and I think one of the things I love out of what you said is that your definition of success can and probably should change because you should be changing and growing. And as you change and grow, your goals change, your definition of what you should be striving for should evolve as well. Whether you have children, start a family, all those things make shifts in it. So it's great to hear from someone like you where it started in one direction and has evolved to something else. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it definitely evolved. And I think the good part about it is that I think in terms of my life, I ended up with better balance between my personal life and my professional life. But it just doesn't happen overnight either. It's not like you just go, whoa, well, you switch gears. It's kind of a gradual type thing. I think the other thing that was really, really important to me is at one point in time, I thought, hey, if I'm working on a project, I need to be personally overseeing it, micromanaging it, making sure it's done properly, and so forth. And at a certain point in time, you get too many things going on. I worked internationally a lot. I traveled to 60 countries around the world in my career. My record was 6 times around the world in 1 year. And you have people literally all over the globe working on various projects. You can't micromanage those. You have to learn to delegate. And to me, that was another thing that was absolutely critical, is to focus on your delegation skills, your communication skills, so that you can get things done and be productive, but not have to be micromanaging it. Your job as a leader, what's the job of leadership? The goal is to implement positive change. And you do that by delegating to people, by trusting and empowering them to make the right decisions. Yes, you follow up and monitor it, but you have to delegate in order to be able to scale an organization. And to me, it comes back to having the proper people on the team with the right culture, with the right chemistry that you've created, so that you can trust and empower those people to make the right decisions.
Did you know what kind of leader you wanted to be, or did you develop your definition and desire for the kind of leader you wanted to be over time? What did that look like for you?
Yes. So I think that in terms of the leadership style, I think that I've always focused on the participative type leadership style. And I was pretty convinced that, being an autocrat isn't really going to work in terms of dictating things, go do this, have this task done by such and such a time, blah, 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 doesn't really work in my mind. And I felt that having a participative style was the best thing. And if I think back and I look back on it, you have to deal with such a variety of different cultures and religions and work styles and everything doing what we're doing. I mean, I remember at one point in time, we had an office out of Singapore and it was a holiday event. So we went out on this boat into the Singapore harbor. And as I looked around the boat, we had about 60 different people there from every different religion, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, you name it. We had people from Germany there, South Africa, Canada, England, Australia, Hong Kong, Macau, Indonesia, the Philippines, and everyone was there with the one express purpose, setting aside all the divisiveness of all the different religions and politics and everything else. We were there for one common purpose, and that was to build the best software in the world. And we were united under that cause. And that to me was all about how do you build a team of people with the right chemistry and the right culture to bring everyone together to be successful. And we were amazingly successful. And it was one of the best feelings in the world for me in terms of being a leader.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful, and that blueprint of participation and input from everybody ended up playing a role in your career. Just so you know, I've always viewed you as a collaborative leader, and my style in terms of being a collaborative leader, I think also has been developed through that. And so I've heard from folks that have reported to me over the years that they've seen my style that way. And when I look back over my life, I really believe I honed that in my time with you. And I'm grateful for that. I do agree with that leadership approach. And I think it's the best way to get the best things out of people. And it also is the type of style that is organically a style that values people.
Yes, I would agree completely. And to me, I think that one of the things that I was successful at was building great teams of people. And that only happens if you establish the right culture and the right chemistry to begin with. And that's the only way that you can scale an organization. And I feel like I've been in situations to scale a company from 5 million to 50 million, from 50 million to 150 million, from 100 million to 250 million. And as you scale that, the single most important thing is that you are bringing in the right people with complementary skill sets that add to the company, add value in terms of what you're doing. And I just can't say that enough, that it's so important in terms of bringing in the right talent, but people that are team players, people that you then train and establish a good relationship with from a loyalty perspective, and then also that you trust and empower them to do the right things.
You know what's also interesting through it with a leader's hat on? A lot of times we talk on the podcast about people maybe trying to figure out how to get into leadership roles and how to move their way through that. To flip it for a minute, when you're on the leader side of it, there's also something really rewarding about getting to the place in your career, I feel this way now, where you have the right team of people and you genuinely trust them and you empower them to do their jobs and you're clear about where you're trying to go as a group, as an organization. You feel like you have your culture blueprint, down. And there's something really rewarding and beautiful about that as a leader that you can, feel every day.
Yes, I think so too. And I think the key thing though is if you say to yourself, well, how did you get there? And I think the answer is that you were very, very selective in terms of who you brought onto the team. I mean, when I would evaluate someone, people sometimes say, hey, don't be judgmental. No, my reality is you need to be very judgmental. You need to bring in the right people. And you have to say to yourself, okay, as you're doing an interview, is this person a giver or are they a taker? Are they positive or are they negative? Are they a pessimist or are they an optimist? And if you bring in the wrong kind of people, you say, are they reactive or are they proactive? I mean, you have to establish the criteria for bringing a person in as you interview them in terms of how they fit in with your culture and your direction. And I was always strongly focused. I mean, I've interviewed hundreds of people and over my career hired thousands of people under me. And it's so important in terms of what is the profile of the people that you bring onto the team. That's the only way that you can be successful.
I agree with you. Let's turn that upside down. Because you have interviewed so many people in your career, what is one piece of advice you would give to someone who is interviewing?
I think that you have to say to the person who you're interviewing. I mean, one of the key things is, are they proactive or are they reactive? So you know that when you get into a job and as you move into it, you're going to encounter things that you've never encountered before in your life. And it's all the once you get to a certain size, you encounter all the ills of society in terms of things like, whether it's drug abuse or alcohol abuse or domestic abuse or, crimes, mental challenges, all these kinds of things. You're going to encounter it all when you least expect it. And I think you have to have someone in place who, not only yourself, but underneath you, that says, okay, here's a problem. I'm going to be proactive in terms of solving this. So they have to have good problem solving skills, good analytical thinking skills, good critical thinking skills. You have to have those developed so that they're going to be proactive.
We've talked a lot about success and advice for folks. What were a couple of the more tougher decisions you had to make as a CEO?
That's a good question. But let me comment on one other thing first. We talked about being proactive. As I said to you before, I've been involved in 7 acquisitions. And when you are involved in an acquisition, people get categorized into terms of different areas. You have a group of people that hide, try to seclude themselves from the new people coming in, and they think that they're preserving their situation by doing that. Then you have a group of people that are kind of on the fence and don't know quite what to do, a little bit paralyzed. And then you have a group that are actually proactive and say, okay, it's a new game. I got to learn the new rules quick and fast. And what you find out is when the new people come in, the first people to get shot are the people that have been hiding out because they say, I have no idea in terms of what value they even add to the table. They must be extra. So they're let go. Then the group that is kind of sitting on the fence sorts itself out one way or the other. And the people that actually succeed post-acquisition are the people who are proactive and say, okay, I recognize this is a new game. We have to learn the new rules. And how do I make this acquisition successful? And be proactive to do that. Take demonstrable steps to make that happen.
Tom, I literally relate to what you're saying so much and agree with you wholeheartedly. When I look back at one of my most important moments of my professional career, it was exactly the moment you're talking about. I think what you're saying right now, a lot of people, some people see it and operate that way, and a lot of times they don't. I think it's just tremendous advice. I think I just felt it and did it when I look back because I was 25. But when I look back to a moment for me, there was acquisition change. And I was at that place where everybody was getting fired. Everybody around me, all my friends, all my peers. And, what do you start doing? Well, you start considering whether or not you should leave. And during that time, I had built up a reasonable resume in sales and had been getting recruited from SAP and some of the other players that were out there at that time. And I remember the day where I sat back and said, I have a choice to make. I'm going to go ahead and take that other path, or I'm going to sit back and I'm going to say, what is the company going through right now? What's happening? Why are they letting people go? Where are they trying to get to? And how can I participate in that change? And I ended up creating a business plan around creating a partner network to help them sell through, to create a new distribution channel at a lower cost as an idea to help align myself to the direction that the new company was going. That ended up getting an interview or a meeting with the CEO at that time, and it ended up changing my whole career. And I ended up staying at that company for 15 years.
Wow. Yeah.
We never would have met.
Right.
To your exact point of where are you falling into during turmoil, during transition, and sometimes the right decision can be to leave. So don't get me wrong.
Right. Right.
Sometimes the right decision can be to dig in, figure out how you can impact the direction that they're trying to go, and make positive change.
No, I think those are excellent points, and you're making those kinds of decisions in a very stressful situation too. I mean, I think that's the other thing that's kind of a challenge, and is okay. How do I get my head around this? What really happened here? But in one of the acquisitions that I was involved with, the person who was the CEO at the time said, "Hey, the new acquirers, they say nothing changes, everything's going to be the same." The day after the acquisition closed, he was fired. And I thought to myself, the rules have changed. We just don't know what the new rules are, but the rules have changed. It's completely different now, and you need to sort this out quickly if you want to survive and thrive, or you better figure out a plan B to exit because it's a new there's a new sheriff in town.
Got it. All right, so we'll come back to what was a very tough decision. But let me ask you this: what was one of the best decisions you ever made as a CEO?
One of the best decisions. I think the best decisions that I've ever made had to do with creating a new product, staying current with the technology, and seeing it roll out and be successful. That to me is it's fantastic when you have this feeling that we did the right thing. And it was the right thing for the company, it was the right thing for the client, and it's just a fantastic feeling when you go, we did the right thing. Now, on the other side, coming back to what we talked about, what's really, really tough decisions, to me, they revolve around conflict. You managing conflict. And it can be conflict with a board member, it can be conflict in terms of an employee or staff. And having to let people go, to me, that's the toughest decision when it's not working out. Because you've impacted someone's career, their entire life. They may have moved to take this job. Here you are 6 months into it and you go, this is really not working out. Or a year into it and it's really not working out. And number one, you always come to that conclusion 3 months after you should have. You always knew in your gut, this isn't working out. This isn't working out. You try to turn it around. You try to make it happen. But it's really not. And to me, managing conflict is one of the most important things. And then I actually, in those kinds of cases, came to the conclusion that I have to look at it and say, by letting this person go, it's actually in their own best interest too, because they weren't going to be successful doing what they were doing. So it's like you have to let them go. You have to let them have a chance at success someplace else because they weren't going to have success where they were at. Now you feel guilt because of that because you hired them, you brought them in. And that's a huge burden that you have in terms of responsibility. But it's absolutely critical to say, you know what? For whatever reason, this was a mistake and it's not working out.
I agree with you. Those are so tough. It's a shared responsibility, right? It's just you as a leader bringing them in and them coming in and doing their part, and then it's just excruciating because you know that there was failure on your part, and it didn't succeed in the way that you both wanted, and that there's families involved, and that's always the worst, right? So, and then I think we learn from each one. We learn from each one, and what to do better next time, and how to communicate maybe more clearly and differently. And, I feel like over time, you learn how to hopefully approach that a little bit better. What, you then transitioned, you transitioned out of these leadership roles, you retired, right? And then how did you end up making the move into venture capital?
Yes. So basically, after I retired, everyone thinks, well, what are you going to do with yourself, kind of thing. And there was a great network of people here within the Orlando area, angel investors that were in similar kinds of situations. And to me, it was a case of being in a position where I could contribute back and perhaps do some mentorship, work with some of these startup type companies to help them scale and help them grow. And I viewed our little group as, I called it Shark Tank with a heart. So basically, we would help the companies with funding, we would serve in an advisory role. We were demanding to a degree, but we were also in the situation where we didn't purposefully crush the management team when they would run out of money, which inevitably some of them do. So to me, it was a case of getting involved with it was a chance to pay it forward or to give back to others who I know have gone through the kinds of things that they're going through, which are very challenging, very difficult, and very stressful at times, but have an amazing potential outcome. So it was a great transition, and it's a great group of people to this day.
Yeah. What do you look for individually and also as a group when you're looking to invest in a company?
Good question there. So in my mind, there's four things that you have to look at. And one is the market. What is the size of the market? Is it big enough for doing what they're doing? Number two is the momentum. Do they have a headwind or do they have a tailwind? I mean, you can get involved in a good market, but it's got some very strong headwinds. It's very hard to progress. And then the third thing is the management team in terms of, do they have a history of success? And if they do, there's a much greater opportunity for growing and doing it again. And then the fourth thing is the model. Do they have a model for profitability and scalability? So I can come into a situation like this, and we've had hundreds of people present to us, and I continuously evaluate, okay, the market, the momentum, the management team, and the model for success and scalability and profitability. So those are the broad categories that I look at in terms of saying, what are their odds for success? And one of the most important ones is clearly the management team that has the resilience to say, we're not going to give up. We may pivot, we may have to turn, we may have to do this, we may have to do that, but we're not going to give up. It's this resiliency factor to succeed.
What is one of the bigger or larger mistakes that you've seen people make when they come in to present to look for funding?
Well, it's obstinance, it's stubbornness. I mean, I've seen people that are absolutely brilliant in terms of a field or a certain area, let's say the engineering area, and they come up with a product and it's an amazing product, but they have no idea how to operationalize it, how to come up with the distribution channels that make sense, how to create the product and make it successful. So they're brilliant in one area, but because they are brilliant in that area, they think that they know it all in that space, and they're not willing to listen to all the other factors that it takes for success in terms of distribution, in terms of sales and marketing, in terms of support, all those other factors that come into
Cash
play.
flow
Cash
management,
flow, exactly.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
accounts receivable. That's
Wow.
interesting. So it's almost an arrogance around the one thing that they're great at, and that got them to the table, but being short-sighted to only focus on that area. Interesting. What about when you think about the best pitches that you've received and something that you may or may not have decided to fund? What was one of the best examples of somebody who pitched and why?
So I think in terms of pitches, it has to be something that they can quickly relate to you in terms of identifying, what is the need in the marketplace? What are the competitors doing out there? Why is there a gap? Why is there a niche? And they're filling that niche. So there has to be a very good, what I would call value proposition that says, here's what we're doing, here's why it's different, here's why it's unique, here's why we will be successful. And it's not always that clear at first. And just like with any sort of pitch, unless you get the attention of the people that you're pitching to in the first minute or two, 20 minutes later, you've lost them if you haven't really established what is the situation, what is the problem, what are the options to solve it, and why you have the solution to make that happen.
When you look at the successes and failures, right? And in the VC world, it's mostly failures and then a massive success. And you're looking for that 10 times plus hit, right?
Yeah, 10 baggers.
10 a 10 banger. What is an example of a company that's been successful that you've worked with?
So one company in Orlando, small company that started out in I would call it kind of the credit card processing arena, going after a very, very low-end niche that the big players were ignoring. So you think to yourself, okay, what's new about credit card processing? Not much. Lots of big players are doing it already. They've got the market sewn up. How can you possibly create some value there? Well, they created the value by going after a niche of the market that was very underserved with a very personal kind of relationship that was established. And they started getting the credit card processing for lots of small businesses, tiny businesses that the big players were ignoring. Well, pretty soon, they went from no customers to a couple hundred customers to thousands of customers. And the revenue is ramping like a hockey stick. And the next thing you know, they're bought out for a couple $100 million by a big player.
That's impressive. So they found a niche, went for it, carved it out, served it. And you know what's interesting is that that's always evolving, right? It's always evolving because the market needs are changing. So vendors are needing to adapt to those different market needs, and it creates more space
Right.
for other players.
Yeah. And the big players in that space, when it came to the little customers who don't do enough transactions to get their attention, all they did was underserve them, overcharge them, and ignore them.
Right.
So that created an opportunity for another company to come in and say, hey, we'll give you personal attention, we'll give you a reasonable price, and we will serve you in ways that you want to be served.
I love it. I love it. What are some type of typical business profiles that people come to you with? What type of markets are they in? What kind of businesses are they starting up? What does that usually look like for you?
It's a very, very wide gamut is the range of the different things. So like in terms of our little angel investing group, we have people with certain areas of expertise. So we have, let's say, certain people with telecom skills, certain people with software skills, certain people with, let's say, hospitality industry experience. Generally, what we will do is we will get a lot of different pitches, but if it's something way outside of our zone of expertise, we just say, hey, go someplace else because we can't add value. We have to be in a position that we add value. So if you have someone who came in who was the ex-CEO of Darden, which is on our team, and somebody comes in with a hospitality pitch in terms of restaurants, there's a lot of value that you can add. But in many cases, if it's outside of our zone of expertise, we just say you're better off to go find someone who can really not only add value in terms of money, but expertise going forward.
Yeah, and I guess there's two sides of that, right? There's the adding value part, and there's also when you know an industry, you know enough to ask the questions that are underneath the hood, if you will.
Right, exactly, exactly.
Because it's so tough to make it. It really is, right? There's so many things against you. You've got to really understand the industry, the client base, the competition, the real opportunities for value. How do you scale? How do you get profitable? There's all these different components that play a role. So you probably want to be involved with businesses that somebody on your team knows enough in order to really get into it.
And then you get all the wild card things. I mean, let's look at the situation. There are so many things that are totally beyond your control. In some cases, interest rates go up. Well, that impacts someone who's in the building arena. COVID comes along, changes the equation completely in terms of people in the office or not. Different ways of doing business. So you have to be so quick on your feet to pivot to what the current situation is that a lot of people fail.
I mean, look at the changes in marketing. Marketing is completely different than what it was 20 years ago. I'll even say 10 years ago. I mean, now with demand generation and the way that marketing is really the top of the funnel in such a strong way, combining data and intelligence and buyer information and bringing that into the sales funnel in a much more data driven programmatic way. It's shifting the way that sellers sell and it's shifting the way that buyers also buy, right? Because buyers today want to be empowered. They want to go on their own journey. They want to look it up. They want to get the information the way they want it, when they want it. And now vendors also have to supply it that way and understand how to balance their need to want to manage the sales cycle and own it as compared to letting some of that go and letting buyers go down the journey the way they want to. That shift in marketing to me is a massive change in understanding whether a business will be successful or fail.
Right. And you take a look, and just in the last year, everything that's coming out with AI. AI changes everything. Some people are going to get it, some people are not going to get it. It's going to create new opportunities and it's going to crush others. So, how do you figure out? How do you capitalize on it? How do you adjust it to what your situation is and be successful because of it versus getting crushed by it? And there will be a whole group of companies that are crushed, a whole new group that will spring out of nothingness because there are new opportunities that come with it.
Let's talk about that. What do you see on the rise, right? What do you see on the rise? You're meeting with entrepreneurs, you're meeting with people who are looking at startups. What do you see as the future of, and how has the trends changed in the conversations you're having with startups and entrepreneurs?
Well, I think in terms of the conversations, everyone is trying to figure out how does AI impact me? And every pitch has an AI component to it. And they feel if they don't have an AI component to it, they won't even be listened to, which is true. So there has to be an AI dimension built into it somehow, some way. Now, is it significant? It's a little bit hard to tell yet. But at least they're taking a thought leadership position of saying, this is how it could impact me, and this is how I'm dealing with it. So I think there's a huge component of AI into everything. I mean, in my own opinion, and I've been around for a long time from the time when computers were behind the glass and you did programming with 80 column cards to the networking to mini PCs, mini everything networking. I mean, there have been so many changes, but I think AI is as big as or bigger than the internet or any other change that's happened in the last 30, 40 years in the computing IT arena. So everyone's trying to figure out, what does it mean to me?
Yeah, I agree. And there's to me kind of two pieces of it as well. There's the positive and how can I leverage it? How can we scale differently? How can we look at the impact on resources and outcomes we're trying to achieve, and then also the negative part of it, right? There was news even yesterday about some choices that Apple might be looking at, and different large business leaders that are saying, you know what, that creates some risk for my business if AI ends up getting into the code. And so there's also the negative consequences that I think people are trying to understand with incorporating AI in the way that they're doing it.
Right. But I think a clear winner, for example, in the AI arena is the cybersecurity arena. I mean, AI opens up all sorts of opportunities for cybersecurity firms from the perspective that it's going to be a greater and greater need. And as you can see with many, many, many organizations, for example, and it's true very, very much so for not-for-profits, where they are not positioned in terms of having good security in the first place, and now they're getting hit with things like ransomware, hospitals, health facilities, many, many not-for-profits don't have adequate security. I mean, I came out of the banking arena and you had bulletproof, close to bulletproof, not 100% bulletproof, but close to bulletproof type security. And now you see that need across so many other industries, and they don't have it. They're not prepared for it. Cities and counties ransomware, health facilities ransomware, all these kinds of things. So it's a huge problem, but it's also a huge opportunity if you're Palo Alto Networks or if you're CrowdStrike.
Right. NVIDIA.
Yeah, NVIDIA. That's right.
What advice would you have for an entrepreneur trying to start a business today?
I think the best advice for an entrepreneur is to really, really clearly delineate what is the opportunity. I mean, put a tight box around that. And how can you create a value proposition that is unique and solves a problem? If you think about it in terms of clients, what do clients want? Clients want a solution to their problems, or they want to capitalize on an opportunity. And if you can help them do either of those two things, they'll buy more from you and they'll give you good references. So figure out, okay, what is your solution? What is your added value? And how can you take that to market in a very crisp and clean way? And that's the best potential for success in scaling a business, in my opinion.
Oh, that's terrific advice. Terrific advice. Tom, something I've never asked you that I just thought of that I'd love to know the answer to is what's the best advice or one piece of advice that you've received from someone that you respect over your career that you've remembered?
That's a good question. Let me think about that for a minute.
Because you've had a lot of interesting people that you've worked for and very successful folks that you've worked for and worked with along the way. What's something that has stuck with you that and maybe it's not a piece of advice, maybe it's something you've seen. What's something that you've witnessed or observed or been told that has stuck with you and made an impact?
So I would say that it's not one individual thing. What I would say is one of the companies that I worked for had a chairman. I was the CEO, but he was the chairman. He was the toughest boss that I've ever had in my life, bar none, except for my father. My father could match him. But he modeled to me what it takes to be successful in terms of a work ethic, dedication, focus, resilience, all those kinds of things. Now, his execution sometimes was pretty tough, ruthless. But what I said is, I'm going to look at this situation. Here is a really, really smart guy who has been incredibly successful. I'm going to figure out how to parse out what are the good things and ignore the bad in terms of me modeling leadership going forward as a CEO. And it was very tough. I had a point in time where I worked every day of the year. Christmas, New Year's Eve, Thanksgiving, didn't matter. working for a venture capitalist and a tough situation for 4 years, every day for 4 years. And it was grueling, but it was also probably the point in my life where I learned the most that I ever learned, because I was continuously drinking from a fire hose. And it was brutal at times, and it was stressful at times, because we were trying to take a company public, at the same time grow the company to show the value proposition, file with the SEC, all those kinds of things. And on the personal side, my wife was dealing with cancer, and I had 2 teenagers. So it was a very stressful time in my life, but also a time where I probably grew the most in that 4-year time period ever. But would I want to sign up for it again today? It'd be tough.
That's terrific advice. Thank you for sharing that. Um, it's a honor to have somebody with so much experience to be able to share all the different things you're talking about. I know in this episode we can go any direction that we potentially want to go. And for those that don't know, to put a little context around this, Tom, your experiences in higher education, in that market, in government, in the finance arena, in tech overall. I mean, in a very broad set of, and of course in startups and entrepreneur and the VC world where you touch a lot of different things. Just tremendous advice for everybody through a wealth of experience that you have. And I appreciate you sharing all of that.
Very good. It's a great experience, and I would make one other comment too. Well, I worked in a lot of different industries, the banking, technology arena, higher education, government side. The interesting thing was there were commonalities that crossed all those boundaries. So I would say to people, don't be hesitant in terms of going into a different industry, because the skills that you learn from the prior one in many cases will apply to the new industry. Yes, it's new buzzwords and new acronyms, but the concepts are still the same. Taking good care of the client, taking good care of your staff and developing them, taking care of your stockholders. Those things are common across the board, and you can apply the skills that you learned in one industry to any industry and be successful.
Great advice, and I agree. And I remember the day you came in, and I remember asking you, why did you decide to come to our organization at that time? And that was actually your answer. You said, you know what? There are things that I feel like I've learned how to do well that I can apply in this business, in the client base, in the model, and all the things. So yeah, it's great to see. There's one question we ask every guest at the end of the podcast, and I'm interested to see what your answer is. If you went back and gave advice to 22-year-old Tom Huber, just off the farm, about to graduate from school, what advice would you give to him?
That's a really good question. I would say take more risk, step outside your comfort zone, commit to continuous learning in terms of whatever you're doing, and focus on how do you increase your skill set to add value to whatever it is that you're doing. And be willing to sacrifice, to do what it takes to learn what you need to learn to be successful, however you define success.
I love it. Thank you so much, Tom. And I also want to say, if I had to add something to the episode, I think it's the importance of staying in touch with great people, people that you appreciate, people that have had an impact on your life, and you've been that for me. So thank you for all the things that you have shared with me, that you have been willing to invest in me over the years. I consider you a friend, a mentor. Really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of each other's lives over the years.
Well, and I would say it's been absolutely fantastic working with you. I mean, we had a great journey together. I think it was incredibly successful, and I learned a lot in the process too. I mean, you've taught me many, many things, and I really appreciate that, and I'm really grateful for that. I mean, you have a wonderful complementary skill set to what I have, different way of looking at things that forced me to think through, okay, what do I need to do next? And I just appreciate that. It's been a great relationship personally and professionally.
Yeah, it has. I also want to throw a shout out to Cleet Simmons, a guy that had a big impact in my life because of you, connected us. Thank you, Cleet. Thank you all for listening to the podcast. Thank you for joining, Tom. If you want to hear more stories like Tom's and others, you can find us on Instagram under the link tree. You can get connected to us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, 2% Factor. Please like and comment as well. So thank you again for joining, Tom.
Thank you.